Now, every organism doesn't get its energy the same way. Some organisms eat and some organisms produce. Now, when I say energy, I want you to keep a general term in mind. Energy is basically related to a chemical called glucose, which is sugar, right? That's how we all get our energy, whether or not you're a plant and you make that sugar, or you're an animal and you consume that sugar. Everything you eat in some way, shape, or form has sugar in it. If you don't believe me, look on the back of any snack you eat, look at the nutrition label, and it'll tell you the amount of grams of sugar that's in there. If it doesn't list sugar, it'll be in the form of a carbohydrate, because at the end of the day, carbohydrates are just big polymers, big large molecules of sugar. That's why people that have diabetes can't eat carbohydrates, because when your body breaks them down, it breaks it down into sugar. So be aware of that. That is the molecule of energy that we're referring to, how organisms get their energy. And you either make it or you consume it. So let's go ahead and jump into this real quick. All right. There are different types, right? You can be an autotroph or a producer. That is the same thing. That's like saying car, automobile. You can be a heterotroph or a consumer, and that's basically all animals. Right? These are typically plants. Your autotrophs and producers are typically plants. And then your heterotrophs and consumers are typically animals, things of that nature. Now, there's ways that we can categorize these consumers based off how they eat. You can be an herbivore, a carnivore, an omnivore, a decomposer, or a scavenger. And that's basically all of the definitions or vocab that we will cover today. The rest of it I'll leave for another day. I'm not going to jump into all that today because it is a short Tuesday, Thursday day. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at all these. Let's start with the autotrophs and producers. You see a picture here of a sunflower, right? Everybody loves sunflowers. Everybody goes, especially if you're one of those Instagram whores. Everybody does like to go out and take pictures of sunflowers, smiling by them, saying cheese. To be honest, I think even I have some pictures on my Instagram from this summer where I was smiling and cheesing beside a sunflower. So maybe I'm one of those Instagram whores myself. Anyway, nonetheless, we're going to start here because this is a great example of how organisms first obtain their energy. Every organism has to have energy to survive, and energy is neither created nor destroyed. All it does is it simply flows from one form to another, and it moves through organisms. So in this image, you have energy being transferred from the sun to this sunflower, and eventually that energy would be transferred to another organism. The ultimate source of Earth's energy is the sun, or the sun's radiant energy. All of that heat that is emitted, all of those rays of sun, that is radiant energy. And this plant will harness that energy and use it through a process called photosynthesis to make glucose or to make sugar. All right, so let's talk about that process and what the autotrophs do. Just like these plants that you see in the background, right? Autotrophs are literally nothing more than a producer. They both mean the same thing. They're called producers because they produce glucose. Now, what autotrophs do is they convert sunlight energy into a chemical energy. That sunlight energy that they're referring to, right, is also known as radiant energy. That chemical energy that they're referring to, which you see right here, is glucose, also known as sugar. This is done by plants, grasses, shrubs, trees, algae that lives on the top of water, that green stuff. Y'all probably seen that before. And they do this, all of these things convert sunlight energy into chemical energy by the process of photosynthesis, right? Now, what photosynthesis does is important. So let me take y'all through this word chemical equation here. What plants and all these things do is they take sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and they convert that, that's what that arrow means, they convert that into glucose and oxygen. So since plants do photosynthesis and they produce glucose, they will be called autotrophs or producers because they're making their own glucose. This glucose produced is energy rich, right? Sugar will give you a lot of energy. Matter of fact, I've said this twice already today, and I'll say it again. If any of y'all have ever met Juan Salinas, right? Little short Juan Salinas, you know, the guy who was actually had the TikTok video of Suggs and the Yo Mama stuff, right? If y'all know little Juanitosa, y'all know he is full of energy. Juan Salinas acts like he has eaten 5 Snickers bars at all times. That's how much energy this little man has. So obviously, you know, glucose is an energy-rich molecule. But now plants, Juan Salinas is not a producer. He has gotten his glucose by consuming. Matter of fact, I think I saw Juan Salinas one morning at 8 a.m. with a Monster or a Red Bull. And that is just a cocktail for disaster. So anyway, these plants get their sugar by producing it through the process of photosynthesis. That's why they're called producers. And they do make this energy-rich molecule called glucose. Now, what happens with that glucose? Well, the plants might use some of it, but it also could be consumed by other organisms. The organisms that consume their glucose are called consumers or heterotrophs. They obtain their energy by consuming or eating, which is like this bear you see in the background here. This bear is consuming a salmon, right? But since it's consuming a salmon, it would be considered a carnivore since it's eating meat. But that's not the only type of consumers there are. There are herbivores that consume plants, omnivores that will actually consume both plants and animals. Then you have scavengers and decomposers. Right now, scavengers are opportunistic eaters, right? If you have a lion in the African savannah and it kills a gazelle, and the lion will feed on that gazelle until it's full or till it's done, and then eventually you'll have things like buzzards and vultures and hyenas come along and they eat whatever's left. Same thing like if a deer got hit beside the road or a possum got hit beside the road, those birds that you see come down, those are organisms that are basically scavengers. They're just eating whatever's available at that time in that moment. Now, eventually, all things eventually will die and decompose, right? All things will eventually die and decompose. You can't just leave that remaining matter there. That matter has to be broken down. It has to be dissolved. Those nutrients have to be returned to the soil. It's almost like a recycling system. Those nutrients have to be returned to the soil so that they can be reabsorbed by plants and put back into the cycle of energy. The organisms that do that are your decomposers. That's things like bacteria and fungi, mushrooms, stuff like that. And all of this stuff helps keep energy flowing, right? That way there's always a constant flow of energy in an ecosystem. Now, all of these are called consumers because they do consume or eat glucose, right? An herbivore, that's easy. It's eating the glucose in a plant. A carnivore, that's easy. It's eating the glucose that's in any organism. An omnivore can get its glucose by eating plants or by eating other herbivores or carnivores. Scavengers are eating glucose because they're eating whatever's available. And decomposers, even though they are breaking down things that are dead or decaying, they are still consuming that thing. They're eating it. Therefore, they are called consumers. All right, let's move on to the next slide. This is just a slide that sort of reiterates what decomposers do. They are the recyclers in an ecosystem, your bacteria and fungi. Just think about it. As energy moves from the sun, right, to a plant, to a herbivore, to a carnivore, to an omnivore, right? Scavengers, all of these things will eventually die. Plants die, herbivores die, carnivores die, omnivores die. So what happens if there's nothing that recycles it, that gets that nutrients back to the soil? Well, it just lays on top of the soil, right? There's nothing to dissolve it, to break it down. So what these decomposers will do is they will break it down so that those nutrients can get back to a plant, right? There's your little plant. It can get back to a plant, And they're everywhere in an ecosystem because everywhere something dies. So decomposers are constantly getting nutrients back into the soil so that it can be reabsorbed by a plant and go back into the cycle. They're found at every level in a food chain. They break down dead or decaying matter and return it to the soil. Then that matter is reabsorbed by plants and moves back to the cycle of nutrients and energy. That's basically what I just drew. All right. Now, radiant energy, this is basically how organisms obtain energy. Radiant energy from the sun must be converted into the chemical energy called glucose. These organisms have to have glucose to do all of their life processes. This glucose is their main source of energy. And that energy is needed to create new cells for you to grow, for you to maintain homeostasis, and to repair any damaged cells. Right? Energy is needed for everything these days. Just even it is in nature too. I know y'all get tired of charging cell phones, tired of charging everything else. Seems like everything's got a charging cord nowadays. But everything needs energy, guys, and that's just kind of how the world and nature works. So glucose is an important molecule, and how you get it is even more important. Now, we do have certain models that show the flow of energy in a food web or in an ecosystem. The one y'all are probably most familiar with is a little food chain, right? At every step in the food chain, there's only one organism. So it's very simple. However, it's kind of unrealistic. It's unrealistic to say that the only thing a fox will ever eat is a human, or the only thing a bear will ever eat is a fish. That's kind of unrealistic. Sometimes other things eat fish. And when you start adding other layers to the food chain, then you start to have something called a food web. It's like a spider web, much more complex. However, it is much more realistic. Now, you will see some of these on the EOC, and you will see some on the test. But we're going to wait till tomorrow to discuss these in detail. There is one that I want to use today because I can basically summarize all our information from today using this food chain. What this food chain shows you, is it shows you the sun, the plants, small fish are eaten by larger fish are eaten by humans. You can also say that's energy flow. Energy flows from the sun to the plant, from the plant to the small fish to the large fish, and large fish to humans. Keep in mind, this is all about how you create glucose, how you get your sugar, how you get your energy. Now, the original source of all energy on the planet is the sun. But what happens is this plant right here, it does a special thing. It does photosynthesis. It takes energy from the sun, or radiant energy, and it will convert that energy into a chemical energy called glucose. And it does that by the process of photosynthesis. So since it is making its own glucose, since it is doing a process to produce its own glucose, it will be called a producer or an autotroph. Now, all of these other levels, all of these, since they are not producing their own glucose, since they're just simply eating glucose that was produced by the plant, all of these would be called consumers, also known as heterotrophs, right? Now you can see that this actual food chain will differentiate between primary, secondary, and tertiary. Well, it's easy to figure out how to differentiate. All you do is you just figure out what the first thing to eat is, right? So the first thing that eats are these small fish, so they are primary consumers. The second thing that eats is this large fish, so it is a secondary consumer. And then the last thing that eats, 1, 2, 3, are the humans, therefore they are a tertiary consumer or a third order heterotroph. You do need to know the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers and how to identify them in a food web and a food chain. And we'll kind of take a little bit more in-depth look at that tomorrow. Not too in-depth, but in-depth enough. Now, let me go over these vocab with you one time. I should have covered all these by now. If you were a plant, a shrub, a grass, tree, or an algae that's in a pond, and you are using the sun's energy to produce your glucose, then you are an autotroph or a producer. Beyond that, if you eat to get your glucose, or you consume other things to get your glucose, then you are a heterotroph or a consumer. Now, I can actually break these down into different types of consumers. If you consume grass to get your glucose, you are an herbivore. If you consume, like a cow, okay, or a giraffe. If you eat meat to get your glucose and energy, you are a carnivore. If you eat both, you are an omnivore. If you eat things that are dead or decaying, then you are a decomposer, and you're actually a recycler in the ecosystem. You get nutrients back to the soil so that it can be reabsorbed by my autotrophs and producers. And then finally, if you were a scavenger, you were just an opportunistic meal getter, right? You just get whatever's available. I'm going to say this, but I don't know if y'all know some of these guys, but there are actually guys that are scavengers. That's right. They wait until some guy is done with their girlfriend to just pounce on her, right? They're like male scavengers, almost parasitic. Y'all may know some guys like that at St. Paul's. I don't know. There's one usually everywhere. If you've got a girlfriend, you better be careful, because there's always a scavenger out there that's waiting for you to be done with that snack. So be careful. But also, most importantly, make sure you understand the biological definition and meaning of all of these things. An herbivore would obviously eat plants. Carnivores will eat typically herbivores. Omnivores could eat carnivores, they could eat herbivores, or they could eat plants, since they eat both. Decomposers would be at every level, because everything dies and needs to be recycled. And y'all know scavengers are everywhere, right? Please, for the love of God, don't let the only thing be that you remember is that I said some guys can be scavengers, okay? Try to remember some of the other stuff from this class today.